welcome back. I'm joined now by Claus Hetting. He is founder of Hetting Consultants, specializing in Wi-Fi, joining us from Denmark today. Claus, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Martha. It's great to be back on the show. I always enjoy this, so thanks very much for inviting me.
Yeah, we always enjoy hearing from you. And last time we talked, you had a lot to share about cloud-controlled Wi-Fi, and I think that is even more significant now that voice-over Wi-Fi is such a hot topic here in the United States. Can you give us a little bit of information about what role cloud technologies are going to play in the implementation of voice-over Wi-Fi?
Right. So I think voice-over Wi-Fi is the classic cloud-managed service in many ways, right? Because it's an IP-based service, and you don't really need the mobile networks to do that. So the classic mobile infrastructure that's used to deliver both today on the LTE networks, the IP-based, but also, of course, the circuit switch, it doesn't apply to the whole idea of voice-over Wi-Fi. So I think what we'll see is cloud implementations of this, absolutely no question, and we're already seeing that. And of course, Wi-Fi is, in many ways, the technology for dealing with cloud services, generally speaking, because it's really the easiest way to plug anything wirelessly into any cloud that's out there. So I think we'll see a lot of that.
Were you surprised by Cablevision's announcement last week about the Wi-Fi only voice and data offering?
Well, I was to some extent surprised that there was no mobile component to that, because what we've so far seen is what we call Wi-Fi first operators that have a concept where 80 to 90% of the time you use Wi-Fi, and in some cases you don't pay for that at all. So, for example, Scratch does that, and then the rest of the time, if you're in your car or you're out in remote areas, whatever, you can of course use the mobile service for coverage, right? And Cablevision doesn't do that. I think it's fantastic that they're trying out a new concept, which is really Wi-Fi only. It's not really Wi-Fi first. It's Wi-Fi only, right? And I think I think it's a fantastic idea. I think there's a market for it in the sense that if you look at where people are, where they spend their time, Scratch Wireless says that 80% of the time you don't need mobile services for anything, because you're in your home, you're in the office, you're in public spaces where there's Wi-Fi anyway, right? That number, that 80% of the time, I think is going up all the time. I mean, if you go to, for example, iPass's website, there's a hotspot counter on that website, and just, I think it was last week, it passed 50 million public Wi-Fi hotspots in the world, right? And I would guess that maybe between 20 and 30 million of those are in the States. And if you look at the growth of the number of Wi-Fi hotspots, if you just follow how the vendors are growing, we're looking at 20 to 30% a year, something in that range. So, millions of hotspots, public Wi-Fi hotspots, are being added. So the density of the hotspot networks, not just in America but everywhere, is really increasing at a very rapid rate. So what Cablevision presumably is doing is kicking this off at a fairly early stage and betting on the long-term development of Wi-Fi hotspots everywhere, as, for example, Freedom Pop is doing as well. And I think they're absolutely right. I think there's room for a $5 a month or a $10 a month service that addresses people who, basically are okay with relying on Wi-Fi rather than cellular and don't want to carry your bill.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit, though, about that increasing density that you brought up. I think that sometimes Wi-Fi hotspots perform less well when they compete with one another. There are a lot of them around, and the frequency's not scheduled, not synchronized like cellular frequencies, so it could eventually degrade a little bit in some of these very dense areas. Do you think, or no?
Yeah, no, this is an issue with Wi-Fi generally, and actually I want to say that right now I'm working with a group of people on approaching the Wi-Fi quality and reliability issue. I think there is a way of dealing with Wi-Fi quality from an industry point of view that the Wi-Fi industry basically needs to address. And I don't want to say too much about it right now, but I think that is a very important issue in the industry that we need to address. That said, specifically as far as Wi-Fi calling is concerned, you've got to remember that we're looking at, I think the codec for Wi-Fi calling is something like 23 kilobits per second, which is minuscule, right? So even a very poor Wi-Fi service will be able to carry voice calls most of the time, unless it's nearly non-existent. So it's a very thin amount of it's a very thin bandwidth, so to speak, a very small amount of bandwidth that you need to actually carry a Wi-Fi call, right? So that makes the situation easier for Wi-Fi calling, generally speaking, and I think that's, the industry has recognized that. And I think it's really important to understand that all of this really changed, I think, in the fall in September when Apple announced the native Wi-Fi calling, iOS 8, and the thing is, when you say that, the Android people get all excited and they say, "Oh, well, we've had it for many years," and that's true. And Android Wi-Fi calling has been successful. T-Mobile has used it for a long time successfully, but Apple tends to have a knack for knowing exactly when this thing's going to go mass market, right? So I think that triggered a lot of things. There's a very interesting implication, I think, on the infrastructure side of this that I want to share with you, Martha. I'm taking over your show here. I hope it's okay. All right. So there's a very interesting thing on the. If you think of it in the simplest possible way, it used to be that to make a call on a mobile phone, you need a mobile network, right? A cellular phone needs a cellular network. Now, with Wi-Fi calling, you don't need a cellular network anymore, right? And that's actually, if you think about it, quite a big shift. Also because it's the carriers doing this, like T-Mobile, for example, and also the other carriers in the United States. So they're saying you can now use any Wi-Fi hotspot, and essentially that is an important point also around Apple's solution is that the way that they've done it with the IPsec tunnel is that the carrier doesn't need to own the Wi-Fi infrastructure in order to provide the service. In principle, you could do it. You could do the Wi-Fi calling thing on any Wi-Fi access point because of the IPsec tunnel and so on. So that's also a big departure, I think, from the carriers wanting to keep their calls on their own network. They will go to the core network, but they'll go through somebody else's access network, and I think that's an important point.
But for the carriers so far, it's a competitive play, right? To bring in more subscribers who will also use their cellular network because that's the network that they can monetize, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a retention play, right? It's to keep customers happy, to keep loyal, and I think T-Mobile's doing all the right things in that area already. So it was a very smart move for them to go the voice over Wi-Fi route and the cell spot route, which is kind of an expansion of the same principle. So you're absolutely right. It's for retention because right now, there's the cellular operators all over the world, I guess, or have switched their business model to make money on data, so they're giving away most of their voice minutes, right? And so, and with the Wi-Fi calling, they've taken that next step into making that ubiquitous for everybody and largely free, right? What I do want to say also is the implications on the network side are really interesting because if you look at, for example, what carriers have been traditionally struggling with, it's indoor coverage, because indoor coverage is very hard to fix. I mean, you can basically do it in a couple of ways. One of the ways would be actually uprooting the cell towers and putting them closer together, which is obviously a non-starter. The other way is to fix it with femtocells, and that's not really been a success. I know there's a few of them out there still, but it's not really happened on any big scale. And one of the ways that people have wanted to do it for a long time is to install small cells in buildings and all of that, to use the license band to provide the voice coverage as well as the data coverage. And that has proven to be a very difficult business case. Now, with Wi-Fi calling, what will happen is that you can use whatever Wi-Fi is there already, or even in the case where you have to go in and install a Wi-Fi network to get voice coverage for cellular, the cost of actually going the Wi-Fi route rather than the cellular route will be a fraction of what it would cost you with small cells or any of the other methods, right? So I think we're really seeing a shift and I would not be surprised to see Wi-Fi calling essentially taking biting a big chunk out of the DAS market, for example, because DAS is typically quite expensive to install, and if you can do all your voice calls on your Wi-Fi network that's already there in your building, why go through the trouble of installing and buying and installing DAS networks, right? So there's a lot of implications on the network side that will be very interesting to follow, and I think it's a natural progression of Wi-Fi everywhere, really.
There is a lot going on. One thing I want to ask you about before we finish is license-assisted access, LTE, basically in the unlicensed spectrum, the same spectrum that Wi-Fi is using. I'm sure you saw Ericsson introduced a small cell for LAA, and Qualcomm as well has done a lot in this area. So do you think that will take away some of Wi-Fi's momentum as far as the voice calling?
Okay, so I'm very, very critical of license assist LTE obviously in what I usually call the Wi-Fi bands. They're actually unlicensed bands, so of course anybody can do in principle what they want. They're within some regulatory framework, right? But first of all, I think it's going to be very, very difficult for the IEEE and the 3GPP to come together and agree on something that works. It's not so much a technical issue, it's more that I can't imagine any part of the Wi-Fi industry that would want to align their standards to 3GPP, who are clearly interested in getting into the unlicensed band, where Wi-Fi is doing extremely well, thank you, without them, right? So there would be no incentive for Wi-Fi vendors, to go that route, right? The other thing I think is probably that, so that's the sort of organizational structural thing, right? The other thing I think is probably the more important reason is that simply the economics of it. These LTEU or license assist units, small cells, are not going to come down in price anywhere close to a carrier-grade Wi-Fi access point. So I kind of tend to think they're trying to fix the problem for which we already have a solution and trying to sort of move into the unlicensed bands because everybody wants band. I don't think it's going to work very well. I don't think the Wi-Fi industry is going to want it. Of course not. And I don't think the economics support it. So, this is my personal view, and I think a lot of experts that I've talked to share that view. We don't really strongly feel that it's going to go anywhere, but it's a very interesting discussion to follow. I know obviously both Ericsson and very much Qualcomm are really into that, and we'll have to see what they come up with in terms of actual live equipment that actually works right. So I'll be following that a lot.
Okay, so will we. Thank you very much. All right, Claus Hetting, Hetting Consultants. It's always good to see you.
Likewise. Thanks, Martha.